first of all, this book is a magnificent achievement, and it's really, everyone has got to go buy it and also read it and wrestle with it, because it is a really concentrated case for why we have to think critically about the basic infrastructure of our lives, in this case, digital infrastructure. So I want to start, my first question is about the last page of your book, and my second question is about the first page of your book. So we're going to start general and get very specific. So the last page, the last sentence of your book, last two sentences. The platform is built upon a fundamental, the platform is Facebook. The platform is built upon a fundamental, possibly irreconcilable dichotomy. Its purported mission to advance society by connecting people while also profiting off them. It is Facebook's dilemma and its ugly truth. So tell us about this dichotomy, what the business model is, why that's problematic, and how you sort of came to that conclusion.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. And I think we should call our two books the Dystopian Bundle. So if you'd like to get them together, we can give you a discount maybe.
Instead of the disinformation dozen, it's the dystopian duo.
The dystopian duo. So that last line really summarizes how we came up with the title. And the title of this book comes from a memo that was written by Andrew Bosworth. He's a vice president at Facebook, where he said to employees internally in a memo called The Ugly, look, we believe so strongly in connecting the world. We believe that connecting the world is so de facto good that there will be collateral damage. There will be consequences. The collateral damage could be that terrorists decide to organize on our platform. It could be that bullying occurs, and so that there's deaths of teenagers. These things are unfortunate and painful, but we believe so strongly that by making every user, every internet user in the world, part of our platform, that we would be doing something good. What he didn't use was really the real terminology that we believe and we concluded is behind this idea. Connecting the world is a euphemism for growth and scaling the business. So growing and scaling the business and profiting from this it's really the dichotomy that we're talking about. They need to serve their users, but they're also profiting off them. And the question is whether they're putting the right measures in place and safeguards in place to protect their users at the same time. And that is the ugly truth. And the ugly truth is that they will, as they continue to have growth as their North Star, as their main goal, that the safeguards for users are always secondary, and we see that over and over. And this is a book really of patterns where we see over and over a scandal, data privacy abuse, Russians interfering on the platform, misinformation about COVID, the former president using the site to spread disinformation about the election and the fact that he thinks he still won. And yet over and over again, the company is always a few steps behind in trying to figure out what to do with it, but they never stop trying to move forward and grow and grow and grow. And they're always introducing new things. So it's sort of like this is a cliche, but it's sort of like they're an airplane in flight and they're okay with that, like trying to come up and create the landing gear as they're in flight. And that's like the perpetual state of Facebook.
Yeah, that is something that they'll use, that we're building the plane mid-flight. And it's interesting that you use the phrase collateral damage, because, one often hears the phrase collateral damage when talking about a war. And so it's like there are all these kind of positive sounding metaphors when in fact, when you really step back and think about it, it's like, is Facebook like a mission, a mission-driven institution, or is it more like a calamitous war? Food for thought. So the first page, just to bring this down to the granular level, because a lot of times, I think a lot of times people think, I get it, I've heard sort of the broad strokes of the argument. Facebook is bad, it's too big, maybe we should break it up, we'll talk about that. I think people sort of think of it as this abstracted thing. What does it really have to do with my life? Often when you think about data privacy and data mining issues, people will understand the premise, but they'll think this is sort of a collective action problem. This is maybe a tragedy of the commons. What does it have to do with me? The first page of your book, post prologue, the first page of chapter 1, talks about a Facebook engineer who goes home from a date and wants to find out more about this woman that he was just on a date with. And so he uses Facebook's internal servers to look up her private messages on Messenger, her photos, including ones that she has deleted, her, right? So the question of privacy suddenly becomes very, very immediate. And right on the first page of reading, I went, oh, I guess I never realized that my friends who work at Facebook know everything about me, even if I haven't told them. So that for me helps to bring home, like, let's talk about how privacy is both a collective action problem and also a very personal problem. And what do you say to people when they say, why should I particularly care about any of this stuff in my life?
Yeah, yeah. And I didn't get to your question about the business model, which I think is tied to it as well. So that the first chapter, when we talk about these engineers who are essentially stalking users, there were several engineers who did that, and they're mostly male. And in many instances, there were men who were stalking women that they were interested in by basically accessing their accounts. And information that goes well beyond the information that you can see among your friends. This is like the private messages, the location data, knowing exactly where potentially a woman is that this one engineer was interested in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and knowing what kind of restaurants she visited. That was the kind of data that it just shows you essentially with the God eye, like how much information Facebook has, and that for the longest time, Facebook did allow its engineers to have access to that. They've actually tightened the restrictions since then. 52 people were fired after this incident was brought to light by their chief security officer. But it shows you how Facebook as a company regards their users and regards their data and regards privacy. It's all of this is commodity to them. It's all part of a business model where your data is sold to advertisers who want to know more about you. Facebook knows more about you, your preferences. They even try to predict what your preferences will be more than almost any other company. Many governments are envious about the data that Facebook has, the kind of data they have. So that was a really illustrative anecdote that we fleshed out and put at the start of our book because it showed the depth and the level of, and the breadth, I should say, of data that Facebook and knowledge and insight that Facebook has about you. But importantly, because I think a lot of people understand that companies have a lot of data, and I think there's oftentimes I hear this from a lot of readers, like, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. But I think it was really important to show how Facebook regards your data. And the thing is, Facebook did not put your safety first in that instance and in many instances going forward. And we saw that with how Cambridge Analytica, this political consulting firm in 2018, was discovered to have reams of data on more than 87 million Americans and users, Facebook users, and they were using that data that they got through a completely open and, policy and program that Facebook ran, where they gave data freely to third parties for many, many years. And Cambridge Analytica got that information and tried to use that to target voters, to try to persuade their voting patterns. And so I think that there's two things to keep in mind when you think about the business. They collect data, but also, and this feeds into their revenues because advertisers want that. They want to be able to target the shoes and the Cokes and the Uggs and the other things to you as users. But also, it's really important to know how Facebook does not prioritize and does not have a history of prioritizing the safety of your data and the security of your data.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the arguments that Mark and other Facebook people will sometimes trot out, where they'll say, "Well, we hear from our users that they want to be served relevant ads. They want things to be personalized to them." And I think it's worth pointing out that there is some truth to that, right? That there is a benefit to giving up your data as well as a cost, right?
Yeah.
That maybe one way to get at this is people sometimes refer to data as the new oil, and there's also, we were talking about, my colleague Jill Lepore wrote a fabulous review of your book, and one of the things she does is compare the journalism you and your co-author do to the muckraking journalism.
Oh my God, that was a dream.
Of,
Go ahead, say it.
of Ida Tarbell, who went after John Rockefeller and really did heroic work, sort of taking him down a peg. My question, and we'll see how far this analogy can go, and you should push back on it, but the analogy between data and oil and the analogy between Zuckerberg and Rockefeller, there are the obvious parallels where this is a titanically wealthy mogul with a lot of power and wealth. then there are the questions of the cost benefit thing, right? There's a benefit to me to using oil. It helped me get here today. I used, it propelled me here literally. There's also the very obvious cost, which is it will destroy the planet. Sorry, spoiler alert, it will destroy the planet. How does that compare to the analogy here, right? The benefits and the costs. Do you see it as an existential threat in that way?
So, yeah, so I think that the parallels are pretty plain. I think that there are absolutely parallels to data being the new oil. This is the currency and the value right now of internet companies. It's not, I mean, all of these companies are data companies. They are Google and Facebook. Their value lies in how much data they have. I think it's worth understanding. So there's a lot of talk right now in Washington about whether we're in a new Gilded Age and whether the big internet companies are the trusts of this time, and whether they need to be broken up. And we'll talk about this actually tomorrow a little bit with Senator Klobuchar. But a lot of what propelled the movement a century ago was not just about how the oil and the steel and the railroad magnates were actually abusing their power in those specific fields, but how there were broader economic, macroeconomic, and societal effects, labor, health, all kinds of issues that were related to that. And I think that when you think of Facebook and Google and these companies and their broader effect on our society, and you think about how the exchange of information is affecting democracies and elections, they're affecting how many people actually get the vaccines and how many fence sitters see something on Facebook and they realize, oh, well, maybe I'm afraid that I heard something from my cousin that makes me doubt whether I should get the vaccine or not. You see that the broader effect is much greater than just the question at hand as to whether they have so much data or not. A lot of it is just their size and the breadth of their influence. So I'm not exactly answering your question directly, but I do think that data is, we are starting to see regulators consider data as a powerful part of business. And they're looking at antitrust through the lens of how much data that companies collect. This is something that Europeans are talking about a lot more than in the US, but we are starting to see that. So yes, if you look on its face, back to the Rockefeller analogy, if you look on its face, you see particular magnates who are so incredibly wealthy and who have so much control over different parts of, that hold so much power and wealth over parts of our society, then the parallels are there, absolutely. And the actual income inequality and the gap between the Rockefellers and the workers is, those parallels exist as well. So if this is the next, and at that time, I should say, the other parallel was that at the time, the question was, how do you restrain the dominance and power of those companies, the trusts of back then, that were hard to define because they were so, in many cases, they were conglomerates with like tentacles in many different sort of operations. I think that sort of redefining of the internet economy is happening right now. So absolutely, there are parallels in terms of just wealth, in terms of understanding power and dominance, and it seems like the trajectory is that Washington is looking at the internet companies in the same way.
Yeah, and that also may or may not have implications about how we as journalists should cover it, right? How we might look back on some of the earlier coverage of the fossil fuel industry and say, gee, if you knew how bad this was going to get, maybe you would have covered it differently. And I think you're starting to see a change in the tenor of a lot of tech coverage as well.
Can I actually just one thing? So I do think that, like, to your point about, because I didn't answer your question about sort of the dangers of data, one of the reasons why we wrote this book is I think everybody knows that Facebook's been in the middle of like one disaster and bad news story after another. Like, this is not familiar. And in fact, that was the challenge. Why write a book, when everybody feels like they kind of know Facebook already? I think that what we felt like where we could provide value is trying to answer the how. How did Facebook get to this point? Like going inside the company and explaining the decisions that were made in the room and really pulling the curtain behind what kind of business this is. This is not just a business of like status updates and sharing photos. This is not just communications. This is an advertising business that's built on data and selling data. And I think that was really key to understanding in the same way that oil is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that is the key. The business model is the thing that keeps coming up in the book, and I think maybe to the point about peeling the curtain back, I think we should give folks just one. There are so many anecdotes in here. I mean, anecdotes is maybe putting it a little too lightly, but there are so many case studies in the kind of blinders that people within the company have on at all times. I mean, one. I'm almost trying to pick a favorite one. Like one that comes to mind is when experts from Myanmar come to the office and tell them, they ask, the Facebook people ask them, well, you don't think like there might be like a genocide, do you, if we don't change our policies? And the guy on the ground is like, yes, there will be a genocide if you don't change your policies. And then he hears them after the meeting saying, he didn't really mean that. Like, he can't be serious. Yeah. There's just a sort of willful. The other one I want you to talk about is Project P. Oh, yeah. How you uncovered that and what it means to you, because there's something about the fact that they can see the things, but they can't really take them in, or they can't really think about their impact. So tell us what Project P is, and then how that wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so Project P is a group, it was actually an initiative within the security team. This is around the time when it was clear that IRA-backed accounts were basically planting a flood of false news and fake news.
This is the Internet Research Agency in Russia that is indirectly funded by Putin to meddle in the election, yeah.
Exactly. And so, I mean, this is a theme that runs throughout the book. The Project P was initiated to essentially root out and figure out how severe the problem was of Russian interference during the election. The reason why, I think what Andrew's getting at, and what we found really startling in our reporting was, in that instance and in so many instances, people were not only waving their hands, they were vociferously screaming, please, please, please pay attention on the ground, like at the mid-level security field. There are big problems. We are seeing things that are not only just dangerous, but can be not just dangerous for the company, but can be disruptive for our democracy. And time again, they were sending file reports up to their managers. Those managers were looking at it and kind of doubtful. There was not a lot of incentive for them to escalate it to their managers. Those managers don't have a lot of incentive to escalate those warnings and reports to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and others involved. Why is that? There is a culture where bad news is not rewarded. Sheryl Sandberg's conference room door has a placard that says only good news. There's bad news is not rewarded. And also you can have plausible deniability if you don't know what's bad, And so you don't want to be the agitator, the one that is the mid-level security official who is bringing bad news. So Project P was one of these examples of where there was a program put in place from the highest levels showing we care a lot about this and we want to make sure that we root out as much as we can and figure out how severe the problem is. But when they did realize that the problem was very, very severe, there wasn't a listening ear from the highest ranks involved in that. And that was absolutely the case with Myanmar. That was a really difficult chapter for us to write. And my co-author, Shira, had been to Myanmar at one point and had reported in 2015 a little bit on this as well, where what was happening on the ground was undeniable. There was disinformation and hate speech spread so rampantly about Muslims, Rohingyas and others. In Myanmar, and this was on the Facebook platform for all to see. Human rights activists were warning other human rights activists who are warning also Facebook officials and meeting with Facebook officials in Menlo Park. It's known as MPK, the Menlo Park campus headquarters for Facebook. And they were having meetings. Facebook was taking the meetings, officials, and saying, yeah, we want to work on this. It sounds like, this is a problem. There was at the time one Burmese speaker who was the content moderator for Myanmar, located in Dublin. And the human rights activists were saying, you absolutely have to increase the number of native speakers. This is a country with more than 100 languages. And all this hate speech and disinformation is spreading so rampantly across the platform in so many languages. We all see it. And so essentially what happens is Facebook does not act on this, even though there's warning. Facebook, we should say, and this is a really illustrative example of Facebook's sort of modus operandi, because Myanmar was one of the countries that Facebook was racing to get into. They're racing to get into new emerging markets because that's where all their growth will be going forward. They've sort of saturated the US market in Western Europe. And they were offering essentially free access to Facebook through this program called Free Basics, so you can get Facebook through your cell phones. So there's all these promotions and these programs to try to get people in Myanmar to become Facebook users. And for them, Facebook is the internet because that was their first access point to the internet. And all of this beyond garbage was being spewed on the site, very dangerous rhetoric. And even though Facebook was warned, there was no action. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, willful blindness. It's, there can be just so much hand waving to warn of problems. And we saw over and over again that they ignored these warnings. And we also see that the people who surround Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, their closest lieutenants, often shield them from this bad news and often justify their decisions to do so because those executives are either so busy growing the businesses or it's arguable how bad the problems are when they come to them.
Yeah, I'm interested in the evolution of this stuff over time, and this is something that we've talked about with regard to Facebook and with regard to Silicon Valley more broadly, that the sort of reputational cost or the friction of being one of these people within their world when they venture out to the coffee shop in Palo Alto or wherever they are, that changes dramatically over time. And you track in the book, I think this is particularly interesting with regard to Sheryl Sandberg, the reception she got from Nancy Pelosi in 2015 as opposed to 2018 is just, the body language is different, the whole tenor is different, and that's vice versa. The traction that Nancy Pelosi has within Facebook changes over time. So, but to the point of how, I'm trying to think about how to formulate the question. Basically, your point about willful blindness, it seems like that's much easier in 2014, 2015, when the whole world is on your side, than it is, post-Trump, post a genocide here or there, post-Brexit, right? So my question, I guess, is, as a tech reporter, how have you seen this shifting over time? Like, how have you seen it in the stuff you're able to get, the way you're able to get it, the way your coverage does or doesn't get pushback? Like, how have you seen the reputational shift? Because it sort of happened on during your tenure.
Yeah. So I think Facebook's been remarkably consistent. They have not changed a lot in their response to all the criticism they received over the last few years. And one anecdote that I think illustrates that is right after the January 6 riots, Sheryl Sandberg gave an interview to Reuters. It was a video interview, a streamed interview, where she said, look, yes, there was organization that occurred on our platform and communication that occurred on our platform, surely, with some of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. And we have problems with enforcement, but you guys, the vast majority of the problem existed on other platforms, not us. And what we saw, actually, through the indictments of people who did storm the Capitol was that was absolutely not true. On Facebook, the site, Facebook Messenger, on WhatsApp, so many different parts of the company, organization did occur there. The original Stop the Steal movement was seeded on Facebook. They did take down that group, but hundreds of other groups emerged after that. So it's not only the willful blindness, what I see is very consistent is the defensiveness, is the feeling that, we're always attacked. Why is Facebook always being attacked? And I thought that interview was a really good example. And internally, we heard from a lot of Facebook officials, God, can they just stop doing this? There's a lot of frustration internally. They need to own up to problems more and move forward. So I think in that way, they're remarkably consistent.
Well, in a way, what has changed is not their tack, but how effective it is, right? They've done the same thing.
Yes.
Even the back cover of your book has this, over the years, their same response to all their crises. And yet what has changed is that people aren't buying it anymore.
Yeah, people aren't buying it anymore. I think that people aren't buying it anymore, and we can get into this later, but people are still on the site, right? So there's a really interesting dichotomy for users when it comes to Facebook. look, Facebook at this point doesn't have a lot of incentive to change course either. They're on track to make $100 billion this year. They made $85 billion last year in revenue. They're valued at $1 trillion. Their business is thriving, right? So as if business in growth is the main metric, then they're doing great. And they're nervous, actually, about competition, so they're pushing even harder into new things, like Mark was just talking about the metaverse, which is this idea of connecting all these different worlds, real and not real, and this, his next new project. So they're pushing forward and forward. So the reception has changed, but also there's little standing in the way. Facebook, from everything we've heard from people who are quite close to Marcus, he's feeling very emboldened these days. A court just threw out the Federal Trade Commission's antitrust lawsuit against Facebook. So the idea of the threat of breaking up Facebook feels more distant than before. So you see Mark on a hydroplane board or whatever it was on Lake Tahoe, carrying the American flag. He's feeling pretty good right now, and the company's looking forward. They're feeling like a lot of the hurdles ahead have been removed.
Well, so maybe we can talk, and you'll get into this more tomorrow with Senator Klobuchar, but you mentioned the threat of breaking up the company.
Yeah.
So, one is, what is the case for and against that briefly? Two, why would it not be adequate even if it did happen? And third, let's say that either that doesn't happen or it happens and it's insufficient. What can be done, right? Because we're talking a lot about there's this big evil blue force field that's like looming, around all of us at all times. What is a future where we're not threatened by the stuff we're talking about? Like, what does it look like to you in broad strokes? Does it look like, just is there any way to think about what a better version of social media or a world without social media could look like?
Yeah, so I struggle with this idea of breaking up Facebook being a solution, and I'm not saying that I think it's I'm for or against the idea, but the idea of breaking up Facebook into Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram just creates three companies with the same business model and the same technology with amplification tools. When we haven't talked about that, but that's such a key part of why the business is successful and why misinformation spreads and harmful rhetoric spreads. And so you have three companies with the same business model, and I'm not quite sure if that solves the problem, and I'm not saying that that's not, that breaking up the company is a bad idea or a good idea, but until you resolve what I think are systemic core problems, which is the business model and the algorithmic amplification, the actual technology tools that feed the business model, then I think you're still at the same place. So
and maybe just talk about the amplification thing, because I think there's this sense that, yes, there's bad stuff on the platform, and yes, they should be better at policing it, but there's bad stuff everywhere, and there's always been fake news, and I know some bad people in my real life, and what would you have them do? And it's a needle in a haystack. What is, when we say amplification is a problem or the algorithm is a problem,
Yeah.
what does that mean?
Yeah, so, by the way, Andrew knows about this way better than I think many, many people. And so essentially, Facebook is in the business of getting you to react. It's in the business of agita. And what I mean by that is it needs you to be afraid or happy or angry or sad to click, to share, to engage. They measure their success by what's known as sessions, how many times you log on, how long you stay, and how often you come back, right? And if you're not agitated, you don't do that. You don't come back, right? And all of this is completely connected to the business model, right? Because when you're engaged, they're collecting information about you. They're getting more insights about you. Oh, Andrew gets really excited when he sees, something about, like Martha's Vineyard and the horse farms or something like that, like that gets them excited. So this is information that we have. These are all insights that they collect. So that's essentially what happens. So, but Facebook, these are things that are how they essentially try to provoke you to be agitated is to put on the top of your news feeds and to send you to groups and make recommendations based on the things that they know that will agitate you. So they design their algorithms to try to evoke these emotions. That's the business, essentially, right? And what works really, really well in those algorithms is misinformation and hate speech. It's just like that is unfortunately what a lot of people react to. And it doesn't matter if you're commenting and sharing and saying, I disagree, that's BS, this is awful. You're engaging. And that's what they want, right? It doesn't really matter if, so the more emotive content that people share with Facebook, the more Facebook becomes stronger and a more prosperous machine, and also that feeds into the machine learning and the algorithms. This is a feedback loop. The machine learning and the algorithms get smarter and smarter as they go, and the more that you engage with it.
Yep. And we're gonna open up for questions in a few minutes, but I would just also add that it doesn't matter whether you're responding positively or negatively, you're still feeding the machine. Another thing that is unfortunately even more upsetting is it also doesn't matter if you're not on any of these platforms at all, because that might be helping you to be less agitated in your life, but you're still living in the world that this information ecosystem has created, right? So you don't get to, because often, there's sort of an out where people will say, well, I'm okay because I deleted all my stuff. And it's like, day to day, you might feel better because you've taken this drug out of your system, but you still live in the world that this stuff has created, right? You still live in an unstable democracy because of this. So I guess to get us to a place where we can ask for questions, do you have, do you think, to go back to the big oil comparison, it can feel like we're very stuck in this eternal quagmire, right? There's this big business model. The business model has won. It has outcompeted its competition, and it can feel like we're kind of stuck there. And maybe we are. But I mean, I guess the question, and this is very speculative, so you don't have to speculate too much. But like, do you think we're sort of stuck with this permanently, or what do you see as potential ways that this could shift?
Yeah, I mean, I think the change has to come from the outside. Mark, I think it's really important to understand that Facebook is Mark Zuckerberg and Mark Zuckerberg is Facebook. And he owns the majority of the voting shares. And so he is, and we show this in the book, he's making so many consequential decisions. He's made the decisions on Trump when it comes to Trump saying, go ahead and drink bleach and UV lighting is a cure to COVID. He decided to keep that post up. When it came to Nancy Pelosi's, a doctored video of her appearing drunk, he was the one that decided to keep that up. He's creating policies that allows for Holocaust denial on the website. So it's really important to understand that structurally within, there's no incentive for change. So I believe it has to come from the outside, and that could be regulation. And it could also be other companies. Really interestingly, Apple's decision to make it harder to track data across apps in their app store has created like headwinds for Facebook's business, their behavioral advertising business. So, and they mentioned this in their earnings call. So there's a marketplace potential response or reaction to change Facebook. And regulation, I think, is a tough one. I think the conversations I had been hearing for years felt really outdated. People talking about, should we have national privacy rules that are, opt-in for data collection or opt-out? That's like 2003, kind of conversations. I think that what you're hearing right now, and there are regulators that have been appointed by the Biden administration who are native tech users. They're millennials themselves, and they think really hard about algorithmic amplification. They're thinking about the business model. I'm thinking about like Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission and Rohit Chopra, who's at the Federal Trade Commission, who's about to go to the CFPB. And they are part of like they're part of this Elizabeth Warren camp. They actually quite literally, are supported by her. And they're thinking about things in a much more structural way. And they're really, I think asking more intelligent questions than I've heard for quite some time. So maybe regulation. I think antitrust is also a tool too, but again, it has to be done the right way.
Yeah, you also have a group in the book called the Coalition of the Willing, which I
Yeah.
like. I mean, just on the point of Elizabeth Warren, and then we'll take a couple of questions after this. You have a couple of places where things that are sort of big tent ideas get reduced to partisanship a couple of times. There are times where somebody asks Mark about human rights, and he says, "Oh, well, we work with Democrats all the time," and it's like, human rights should not be a partisan issue. There's a similar thing with antitrust. Oh, well, that's an Elizabeth Warren thing, when in fact it's just sort of an American history thing, like we used to have antitrust enforcement. How do you deal with this both in regard to this story and also from, at the paper of record, like how do you deal with things that have become colored by partisanship that you don't think inherently should be? Like how do you deal with that in your writing?
Yeah, I mean, these things have become so politicized. Things that were, although some of these things are bipartisan too, like antitrust.
Well, everyone has to find a reason to hate tech these days. It's just a question of how you get there, but yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing that unites R's and D's right now is Facebook, or their disdain right now for Facebook. I think, well, look, the company also has responded to this partisanship. So there's a fascinating cultural divide right now at Facebook where people at headquarters and PK see what's happening in their Washington office and they're just so disgusted. They think it's incredibly cynical that everything should be seen through this sort of political lens, that, the lobbyists are always trying to make sure that they placate both sides and that really important policy decisions are based on that, and the idea that, and one great example is there were a lot of security officials who wanted to take down QAnon sites and QAnon groups early on, and they were told no by people in the Washington office. You can't do that. They're gonna think that we're anti conservative, that we're gonna think that this is like an attack on the far right. And the people on the security team are thinking, are you insane? This is about security. This is about conspiracy theories, about, pedophilia rings and pizza parlors and Washington, like Washington, D.C. And it's like all the dangers that come from that. And something happened around when Trump was elected where a lot of the decision making became much more political and viewed through that filter. And the role of one of our characters, Joel Kaplan, who is the head of global policy at Facebook, who is also the head of lobbying, essentially, there, really became a much bigger voice in these decisions and said, look, people already think that we're a liberal company. Like, this is a new world. We have a Republican president who is unpredictable, and we have a majority Republican Congress. If you don't want the business to be at all impeded with regulations that you don't want, you've got to start, ingratiating the desires of the Republicans, Well,
and he had a particularly great phrase for that.
Yes, and this was when Trump uploaded a video during the campaign where he promised to ban all immigration for Muslims. And people within Facebook said, this is absolutely a violation of our hate speech rules, take it down. And Joel Kaplan said, this is not a good idea. He may be the president. Don't poke the bear. Republicans are already angry at us. Don't poke the bear, is what he said. And so that was sort of the start of this chain reaction where everything became more politicized. And what happened was also Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and other executives really felt out of their comfort zone. So they relied heavily on Joel and others within the Washington office for their expertise. And the thing is that ironically, and I think quite predictably, Facebook only painted itself into a corner. Right now, nobody likes them in Washington because they showed their ability to be so fickle based on wherever the political winds were blowing on politics. And it was viewed absolutely as transactional or opportunist, and they got nothing out of it,
Yeah, I love Don't Poke the Bear because it's such a vivid quote, but it's also such a vivid illustration of the problem of trying to do descriptive reporting when descriptions are taken as, like, imagine there's a bear coming toward your campsite and you're trying to describe, like, something is coming for our snacks, and it's like, well, you can't say that, you really have to say that, some people believe that there's a bear, but other people believe that our snacks are totally safe. And it's like, I'm just trying to describe what I'm seeing. So if anybody has questions, we can go to the mics or, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. I don't know if you're on yet. I mean, you can just shout it out as far as I'm concerned. I can repeat it. I can hear you.
I just wonder, my questions were about, like, the security. So a couple of years ago, there was a campaign to say, like, let's everybody get off Facebook.
Yeah.
And I wonder if people shared that on Facebook.
Yeah.
Could Facebook monitor that and say, like, we don't want this to be shared? Like, the algorithm will take away any criticism of Facebook within the platform?
Right.
Are you
aware of any of that, that they could actually control that?
Right. So the question is, could Facebook censor criticism of Facebook on the
Yeah.
platform? I mean, there's actually been cases of the opposite happening, but I'll let you speak
Yeah,
to that.
yeah. I mean, in theory, yes, but I don't think that that happened. I don't think that they did, and I don't think that there is incentive for them to. I mean, it would just be so apparent. And I do believe, and this is, we didn't get to this, but I do believe that they feel so strongly about their position on free expression, so strongly that it's gotten to them in a lot of trouble, and in a very sort of shallow way. They think about expression in not nuanced way, that's the kind of thing that they would allow. And because they believe so, and Mark Zuckerberg believes so strongly in this libertarian idea that more speech will drown out bad speech, that the best speech will rise to the top naturally. But this negates the idea that there are algorithms that are always goosing the system to try to get the worst speech to the top of your news feeds. And that's sort of one of the ugly truths that we explore in the book.
Yeah, one of my favorite ironies is that right after, this is in your book, right after Newsfeed was turned on for the first time, people formed a group saying, please get rid of Newsfeed, and that group rose to the top of Newsfeed because it was the thing that was making everyone the most pissed off. So it just sort of proved its own case. Yeah.
So I work for a large media organization that, like it or not, and I think most of us don't like it, sees a significant amount of our digital traffic come through Facebook referrals. And it's a company that I think if we'd known 10 or 12 years ago what Facebook has become, we never would have waded in those waters, but now we're stuck. So what's a company, any sort of organization to do now that would love to not support a company that is literally eating away at its own revenues? How do you move forward? How do you try to get out of the business of being in that business?
It's such a hard question. The Facebook and Google are the gatekeepers now, right? They have 85%. They're a duopoly in the advertising business. So yes, you are actually damned if you do, if you damned if you don't, right? You are essentially feeding the beast that's killing your company, like your business model. It's really hard. So there are a few efforts in place right now in Washington that I think are interesting. There is right now a lot of discussion on an antitrust carve-out that would essentially allow media companies to collude and to jointly negotiate with the platforms for better fees and maybe even for data that they want to as well. That's one defensive/offensive effort that's happening in Washington. I do think that these sort of like surprising efforts by like Apple that I described on data tracking, that was so interesting to see how much one giant going after another giant in the field affected everyone, had a downwind effect, and potentially can affect everybody. So that can potentially loosen the grip a little bit on these companies. But look, we're in the same world. We had a panel last night on the future of journalism. God, I feel like such a downer. It's really hard to see a clear way out for publishers to thrive. That said, I think what you're also seeing is this is not for everyone. This is the biggest companies that are doing this well. Subscriptions have become generally accepted as the most robust and survivable business model for media. And advertising has just become so fickle, if you will. It's really hard to predict the outcome going forward. So, but not every company can charge. Like I was just talking to Jane, the publisher of the Gazette last night, and she's lucky as a local news publisher where she has an audience here that's incredibly engaged with the community, with a readership that's an avid readership in general, and people. So her business is doing fine, and she has to work hard, but her business is like completely an anomaly compared to all local publishing firms. So she can she can charge, and maybe other local firms that have similar demographics, but this is a little bit of a unicorn, what's happening here in Martha's Vineyard for local news. So it's hard. There are possibly regulatory, possibly market, sort of big tech beating up on big tech, and then subscriptions, it seems like. I don't know, Andrew, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you cover. I mean, there's also the Australia thing, which is another model. But yeah, it is. I mean, the first step is knowing you have a problem, right? So we're at least now in a position where we know that because, as you point out, for the first 10 years or so, there was this kind of thought that, well, this is an innovation, this is going to redound to everyone's benefit, we're all going to work together, and now the kind of, the guild is off the lily to a certain extent, and we can see how Amazon preys on book publishers and how Facebook preys on news publishers. I mean, that's all clear. The question of how to go after someone with that much market power has never been easy, but I think of it, this is sort of my obsession, which is why I keep bringing up the oil thing. I think of it as the whole ecosystem has to change. You can't get out of, it's the same way that like Al Gore has to take, planes to go around to talk about climate change, right? You can't get out of using the system to, using the master's tools to dismantle the house until you dismantle the house. So it's this weird kind of existential trap, but we can't build a new entire media ecosystem until we've built an entire new media ecosystem. So that's the challenge before us. It's not impossible because, these schmoes did it when they were 23 years old, but it's hard.
Being one of maybe the few people that's not on Facebook, how do you avoid, your data going to other companies like Google or Amazon? And even how do you interact with the business, say like a local radio station that says, follow us on Facebook, or they run, whatever they do on Facebook. Can you make an impact as an individual, I guess, or is what you said going to be requiring, such large movements, in the ecosystem that I don't think I'll see for a decade or more? So how can you do it as an individual? Where do you go?
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. I think there are two things to consider when you think about your own agency. Number one is understanding why you're seeing what you're seeing, and hopefully if you read the book, you can understand why things go to the top of your news feed, even though you don't know why that same friend their comments keep going to the top of your, there's a reason why. It's really hard to avoid Facebook and Google. And we're not advocating, my co-author and I, that you just leave entirely. We don't think in some ways it's realistic. I'll just be like a personal example. There are, sorry, my daughter's here. My daughter's about to go to college, and there's a parent group on for her university that's on Facebook. And if I want to know what the parents are talking about ahead of the start of school in fall, I've got to join Facebook in this Facebook group. And that's just one example of many Facebook groups that I kind of, I must be part of. This is just the way it is. I think that so the first is literacy and understanding why it is that you see things at the top of your news feed, and also thinking twice when you see like the source, like of Occupy Democrats or the Denver whatever Post Green or whatever source, and understanding, well, maybe that's actually not a reputable website and that source of news is not reputable. I think the second is also just think of it a little bit more as like moderation, almost like sugar, just like I like to see when my nieces and nephews post something about like something that happened in their new job. It's nice to hear like some updates about their lives. But am I gonna feed the session machine of Facebook where I'm on like coming in 20 times a day? I don't want to be part of that. So I think about it like, my family will disagree that I don't like sugar, but like I try not to have too much of it. So I think
She was the only one who passed up the chocolate cake last night. I will have you know. So she practices what she preaches.
Thank you.
I agree, and I think I love food analogies because it really brings it home. Like, there is no world where we don't eat food, but there's a world where we have a healthier relationship to food, and we don't. And if we went into the biggest supermarket chain in the country that was one of two dominant supermarket chains, and everything on every shelf was like Twinkies and rat poison, and that we were like, well, this is the marketplace, what would you have us do? We would not accept that, right?
Yeah.
And yet if we go to the dominant informational companies and they're serving us the informational equivalent of rat poison, and then they say, sorry, free speech, nothing we can do, right? We shouldn't accept that. So the literacy part is not accepting the sort of rigged business model and the rigged informational ecosystem and seeing it for the kind of false matrixy thing that it is, and then building a collective, really ultimately it's about building the collective power to break that, but that's really friggin' hard.
And then the other practical tip I would give is there are some things you can do to at least lessen the amount of data collection that they do. You can go on incognito mode on your browser. You can, like Google allows certain settings that minimize some of the data collection. You'll never be discovered by these companies. They know you. They're following you. But there's some things that you can do to at least lessen your footprint.
All right, we've got time for one more. If anybody have, yeah, one more.
So, if you're a good tech company, you're worried about disruption. Did you hear, what does the company that disrupts Facebook look like? Do they have an image of that in their heads?
Oh yeah, Mark Zuckerberg is paranoid about this. I mean, this is what keeps him up. Regulations don't keep him up at night. The idea of, people being very angry about Facebook doesn't keep him up at night. What keeps him up at night is TikTok. It's the idea of somebody else doing AR and VR, augmented reality and virtual reality, better than Facebook. It's the idea that there will be a metaverse and Facebook won't be in the center of it. So I think you have to understand Facebook, you have to understand Mark Zuckerberg, because as I said, it is completely the embodiment of him, the company. And he is somebody who, from the youngest ages, just had a kind of voracious competitiveness and ambition that I think a lot of people don't have, but you see kind of a lot in Silicon Valley, actually. But he sees his place in history, as well as Facebook's place in history, as having impact with all caps impact, and being something that's very lasting. He doesn't see Facebook as a MySpace that's a come and go kind of a thing. So what keeps, in terms of what might be disruptive, would be probably the way that people communicate going forward. So right now, Facebook is the dominant communications platform, the exchange of ideas, right? So how people access and exchange will probably be the changing factor. So is it going to be through augmented reality in goggles and headsets? Is it going to be I don't know, whatever, a chip in your brain going forward, whatever it might be? So the format is, I think, what keeps them up at night.
Yeah. I think it also really annoys him that TikTok is the one thing he can't buy, because he's just, in the past, just either bought or copied every competitor. So either buy Instagram, copy Snapchat, copy Twitter. But TikTok, he can't. He wants to get into China so bad that he offered Xi the chance to name his child. So the fact that he can't get into China really bothers him. So that gives me some solace. Okay, guys, I think that's it. Everybody get off Facebook. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you for your time.